thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be here today, and I want to thank Multifamily and all the staff for putting this breakfast on today. I'm going to be talking about a legislative update and really focusing less on the update because there's not a lot that's changed, at least based on the recent pace of change, and talking more about the forecast and what might come next. It's interesting to go last on a presentation like this, especially today. There is not exactly a whole lot of optimism, at least for the short term, but I'd like to hopefully end with a little bit of that. And before I do, I would like to say, we've seen a lot of graphs and a lot of data and a lot of information. And that's so critically important for setting good policy, right? Because you do need to take a step back and look at the big picture so that you know where you're going, right? So that we're in this incredibly important industry which provides an essential service for people, right? We provide housing. And I can say it's an honor to represent people in the housing industry, many of which are here today. In my practice and in my work with my partners, we work with the owners of management companies, owners of properties. We work with managers, we work with staff. In our day-to-day, even we work with residents. And so we get a fairly broad understanding of the way the industry works. And again, I'd like to say thank you to the elected officials who are here today and who are listening, and also to the candidates as well. So thank you so much. Because it is critical that we have engagement and conversations with policymakers so that they can keep that context before them, so they can understand what it's like to run a property and the challenges that come with it, and what is essential to building more housing stock. And so it's in that context that we look at where we currently are with the legislative update, but also where we may go. Because unfortunately, it's a little bit, perhaps, there's not great optimism as far as where the policies are headed. But I think that if we have those conversations with policymakers, we can shift that and influence that so they can see how those policies might impact housing, how they might reduce housing that could otherwise be built, and how they can support the housing providers in their work to ensure that these communities are livable and safe. And I really want to thank kind of some of the other speakers today to highlight that, because as an attorney, what we have seen is we have seen a lot of safety issues as well. And there's been huge challenges in how to manage these properties through COVID, which I just would like to actually give a round of applause to all the management companies who have managed these properties through COVID and today. So I don't have any graphs for you, so I apologize. And I only have about 4 slides, so we can get out of here pretty soon. But the legal update is pretty simple. The Oregon moratorium ended on October 1st of 2022. So the safe harbor protections that have been in place for 2.5 years have now ended. And for people who are no longer paying the rent or still aren't paying the rent, some of the notice provisions have changed, and you only have to give a 72-hour notice now to end a tenancy for people who have still continued to not pay their rent. While the Oregon moratorium has ended, the federal rules do remain in place, and so it's still important to note that we have this unique situation where there is still some federal regulation that's impacting the properties. And so one of those is the CARES Act. So I spoke with one of the speakers earlier that in a lot of the financing documents, if you have a federally backed mortgage, if you have a Fannie and Freddie Mae loan, then your lease doc or your loan documents might require that you still give a 30-day non-payment termination notice. So good to know that those protections are still in place for those residents. And for any HUD properties, certain subsidies at play, you definitely have to give a 30-day non-payment notice. And there's also still some notice requirements about potential available rental assistance for those residents. So looking at that, I think it's nice to take a step back and look at some of the trends that we've seen over the last 2 years to see where we might be going next so that we can shape good policy. So in Oregon, we certainly have seen rent control. We were the first in the state to adopt rent control, so we've seen that. And with SB 608, that is variable based on CPI plus 7%. We've also had the moratoria that we've just lived through, which has just ended. We've seen changes to screening. So who do you have to allow into your property? What is your standard? And those standards have been changed, sometimes in which to ensure that people have more access to housing. In addition, we've seen even climate change affect our industry, and we've seen the cooling bill, which was enacted last year, which I had the honor to work on with some of the legislators in Salem to help draft. which was an incredibly good experience, actually. So whereas this was a new regulation that required that certain cooling devices be allowed and couldn't be prohibited, and in fact, for new housing being built in 2024, you're going to have to provide cooling, at least some form of cooling in those new buildings, which will, of course, add to the cost, right? And which will affect how much housing we have. You know, if there's one thing that everybody has noticed, is it's been hot, especially in October, right? This is a bit abnormal to be out at the pumpkin patch and being very regretful that you wore jeans and a sweatshirt with your kid. So you see that, though, and it would not be surprising to see kind of more of those types of bills. And then, of course, at the federal level, we've seen more interest in the housing industry generally through COVID, through the CARES Act. Even the Center for Disease Control thought that they had jurisdiction over the industry and got involved, and the Consumer Financial and Protection Bureau. So you see a lot of interest in our industry because it's so kind of critically important. And I think those trends give us a sense of where we might be going. So these are some potential issues that could be at play in the next legislative session or at the local level. And those would be perhaps an end of non-renewals altogether. It could be a further tightening of rent control limits below 7%. In addition, I think we're going to see more local rules, which is really tough for management companies and for owners because there becomes this hodgepodge of rules in different cities and counties and jurisdictions, and it's really hard to keep track of them all, and that increased the costs as well. So it would be nice to see uniformity in the housing industry and the rules and regulations. In addition, I think we'll see probably more indigent legal funding, which is laudable. People should have their day in court, they should be represented. But of course, what we've seen from the legal industry and side of things, and I think my colleagues from other firms would agree, and I think that kind of what Andy had pointed out with kind of the news articles, that they're written in a way to where people want to read about them. They're not written about in a fair way that really takes each policy and perspective into a place. They need readership. And what's exciting is conflict, right? People angry, people upset about things. And certainly that part of the story is accurate, right? It's fair for some people to be angry. But at the same time, you need to look at the whole story. And in court, how that translates is you have very expensive disputes now, which drives up the cost too. And so the policies and the ideas are great, but it's the implementation that's really important as well. I think that we will continue to see new regulatory bodies like in the city of Eugene, which is going to oversee landlords, and increased perhaps federal intervention depending on how the election goes this year. And so with that, I will leave you. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much for listening.